Today, who's moved to the fridge? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where my latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I'm joined again by Robbie Barwick. Hello, Robbie.
Hello, Martin.
Now, we should just explain the title because essentially we're talking about when you move the fridge, what do you find underneath it? Cockroaches, quite often, right? And there's an analogy that was used quite recently in the context of the banks.
Yes, the banks. Well, I think it's a good analogy. Scurry like cockroaches. They like operating in the dark, basically. And someone's got to pull the fridge away. And today, that process started in Parliament. A bill was introduced that will remove the fridge and expose all those doings to real sunlight. And that's what we want to talk about. That's what Bob Katter did in the Parliament today.
Yeah. And this is a bill essentially brought into the Parliament specifically on who audits the banks and how they're audited, and essentially making sure that we get better disclosure as to what's really going on under the hood.
Yes. So it's called the Australian Banks Government Audit Bill 2019. And it was introduced by Bob Katter this morning. Adam Bandt from the Greens seconded it. And, because what we're finding is outside of the major parties, there's a growing agreement with all the crossbenchers on the need for this kind of reform. And I think the reason for that is because the crossbenchers are not controlled by the big vested interests, right? The two major parties are. There's some signs there of some of that control of vested interest might be weakening, but still that's the way it's been for too long. So that's why you can have completely different people like Bob Katter and Adam Bandt supporting the same bill. But what this bill does is motivated by two things. One is the poor reputation of the people who currently audit the banks. And if you look at them, I tell you what, you would have replaced them long before now, right? And you and I have done a post on this, and you saw them from the inside. But there's four big global audit firms: PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and Deloitte. And they audit something like 98% of the world's biggest corporations and banks, right? They're an oligopoly, and they really do exercise a lot of control over the system. But they're the people who tell the public that the banks are sound, right? And so, we have something like 25% of the Australian share market by market capitalisation is the big four banks. That means a huge number of Australians are directly invested in them, either directly through their super funds, because they've been given a clean bill of health by these four firms. But these four firms collectively in Australia, collectively are an $8 billion business, yet no one audits them, right? Collective on their own, each firm is very big in the top 200 firms in Australia, very high up, but nobody audits them, right? Who audits the auditors? Nobody. Yet they have this say over the banks and our perception of them. And we would argue that itself is dangerous, especially because, and you can see it in the clip we'll play of Bob Katter's speech, who pays the piper calls the tune.
The member for Kennedy.
I present the Australian Banks Government Audit Bill 2019 and the explanatory memorandum.
I thank the member for Kennedy. The clerk.
First reading, a bill for an act to provide for the auditing of Australian banks by the Commonwealth Auditor-General to reinforce the constitutional obligation of the Commonwealth to regulate Australia's banking system and resultant currency and credit within the Australian economy, and to better protect deposits within Australia's banking system and for related purposes.
Now that will give you the level of staggering and towering incompetence by the auditors in this country. They are not to be trusted. The greatest collapse in human history The GFC collapse touched off in the United States, and I quote, Ernst Young gave a clean bill of health to Lehman Brothers in July 2008, 2 months before its bankruptcy precipitated the global banking crash. The New York Attorney General accused Ernst Young of helping Lehman Brothers engage in a massive accounting fraud. So the auditing, where the business to be audited picks the auditor, and the auditor works for that business. I mean, it's by definition not an audit. By definition, it can't be an audit. I mean, you're employing the person. What's the person going to tell you you're a bad guy? Well, not to my knowledge, in the history of, and I do know one case. It was a case that occurred in Queensland, a very big company, 17th biggest company in Ariadne, 17th biggest company in Australia. And in this case, a good friend of mine was the boss of Arthur Andersen, and he said, I can't clear this company. And so in the deal that was taking place, so they were sacked. And they used another auditor. That's how the machinery operates. Now, in this case, the government has given a guarantee, and so they should. I agree with the guarantee, that all 4 banks. So I told my wife to invest in the banks because the government, unless the government goes bankrupt, well, that could be on the cards too, I suppose, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think it's so at the present moment, Mr. Speaker. So invest there. The government has given you the world's safest investment provided for you. Now, the government has given this in the knowledge that there is no auditing taking place except by an auditor employed by the bank. I mean, you pay the piper, then you call the tune. So, I mean, this situation has got to come to an end. And when we see this impending doom upon the Australian economy, where there's 1,400 billion a year going to the stock market, and the total national income is only 1,800 billion, we have a big problem on our hands. Mr. Speaker, what you're looking at is a giant Ponzi scheme. And like all Ponzi schemes, eventually it comes to a very, very bad ending.
Concluded. Is the motion seconded? Is the motion seconded? The member for Melbourne.
Mr. Speaker, I second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
Thank the member for Melbourne. Question is this bill be now read a second time. The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting, and I call the clerk.
Even if there's no track record with these audit firms, they're horribly conflicted. They earn more money consulting to these banks than they do auditing the banks. And the audit's supposed to be fair and it's supposed to be truthful. And if there's bad news to deliver to the banks saying you've got to change your practices, that's the job of the auditor. But they're not going to do that if they're making a lot more money as consultants. So that alone is a serious risk in the financial system, right? And the second reason, which we can elaborate on a bit more, second motivation for this bill is the growing concern a lot of Australians have that there could be a lot of real risk and danger in the bank's books, right? Just because of the nature of the Australian economy. We are a property bubble loaded with debt. And the banks claim these massive profits, but they downplay the risks, right? But no bank in the world has ever been as exposed to property and a bubble to boot as our big 4 banks are. And that alone means wise people should be asking, what are the risks in there? And that's what this bill will do. Plus you have the derivatives and all those sort of things. So those 2 motivations have driven this bill, and now it's in Parliament, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that, of course, those big four banks use what's called the IRB method of risk calculation, right? Which basically means they mark themselves.
Yes, which is good work if you can get it. My high school daughter would love to be able to do that, I'm sure, right? Doesn't happen in the real world, or it shouldn't happen in the real world. But the banks, well, no, what I'm saying is banks aren't the real world. They're a special case, and of course they have this backstop, which is the government bailout. They're guaranteed by the government, whether they admit it or not. They are, right? And that allows them to be reckless in this regard, and we can't allow it to happen. So in the bill itself that Bob's introduced, that Section 7 is audit requirements, and those audit requirements direct the Auditor General, because that's what the bill does, tells the Auditor General to audit the banks instead of the big four auditors. It directs the Auditor General what to look into specifically, not just a general audit, what to look into specifically, and those include the internal ratings-based models that you just said. It includes the property portfolios, it includes the derivatives portfolios, it includes the provisions for bad debts, none of which we know are to be adequate, right? Let's actually see what the real risks are.
Yep. Great. So it's been introduced. What happens next?
Well, what happens next depends on the nature of the financial system, if you will, and the politics around this. I think that the politics are shaping up to be quite interesting, because this happened today, Monday. I was in Canberra last week, and I hung around a bit longer than I normally do, because on Friday there was a hearing of the Parliamentary Joint Committee into Corporations and Financial Services inquiry into the regulation of auditing, which you and I did a post on a little while ago and encouraged people to make submissions. And they got a lot of submissions, right? So I attended that hearing just to see that one. They did 3 days of hearings. That one was in Canberra. And I got to observe and meet Professor James Guthrie, who's an associate professor not an associate professor, distinguished professor of accounting at Melbourne Business School. And he actually, in his testimony, he foreshadowed this bill and endorsed it, right? Now, James Guthrie is an interesting character because he's in the accounting world, he's taught overseas, etc. He knows people that I know in the UK, such as Prem Sikka, Professor Prem Sikka. And Prem Sikka led a team that did a report for the Labor Party in the UK into the auditors last year. And that report was excellent. And it recommended what this bill is, a statutory auditor for the banks, a government auditor for the banks. It also recommended that the auditors should be broken up. You shouldn't have auditors that both are auditors and consultants. Break them up, right? So that was a recommendation made roughly a year ago, because that report came out in December 2018, actually. We called for this bill in January this year, and now it's finally been introduced into Parliament. But lo and behold, what's transpired in the meantime is some kind of a shift in politics in Australia, where there was a growing attention on this. Edmund Tadros in the Financial Review has been writing a series of articles on the auditors. And you had scandals like the one involving Ernst & Young and Ken Henry of NAB from 2018, when in the middle, came out later last year, earlier this year, in the middle of the Royal Commission last year, he's having a private conversation with his auditor, Ernst & Young, and telling them, we know we're still selling products that are crap, but we're still selling them, and we'll have to remediate for those in the future. And Ernst & Young didn't say anything, right? Because this is an example of the conflicted relationship. So some of these things conspired such that, whereas when the Royal Commission had been called at the end of 2017, the Greens and National Party, etc., had agreed to include the auditors. The Greens and National Party had agreed to include the auditors in the terms of reference. Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison took them out for the official terms of reference. So the Royal Commission wasn't allowed to look at the auditors. So here's the whole banking scandal. Hardly looked at APRA, the regulator, and hardly looked at the auditors, right? How can you tell the full picture without that? Well, something's changed, because as of August, the Parliamentary Joint Committee said, no, we're going to have an inquiry into the auditors. And this Professor James Guthrie gave an excellent testimony at the hearing, and it was based on his submission, which is effectively applying to Australia what this UK Labor Party report had said. We need a statutory auditor, and we need to separate the auditors. Professor Alan Fels, the former ACCC commissioner, had started off the hearings that day, and his testimony was excellent. Now, let me paint the picture, Martin. Here's the chair of this committee is Senator James Patterson. Now, he makes me feel old because he's barely 30, I think. Young guy chairing the committee. To his left were the Liberals on the committee. To his right were 2 Labor MPs and Senator Whish-Wilson from the Greens, right? So the people on his right, or to the left of the viewer, they were really going after the auditors, right? Big time, and going after this conflict of interest. The people to his left, the Liberal Party guys, they were running interference. They were not happy. They were trying to disrupt the questioning, etc., right? Because they weren't liking where this was going. But I was struck by how much, especially the Labor Senator, Deb O'Neill, was pushing hard on this question. When I'm in Parliament, I look for signs of genuine progress, because what you often see, politicians are always happy to make a point for political purposes, point scoring, right? But that's irrelevant, because they'll quickly throw that over. If it's not principle, they'll throw that overboard. What I saw coming from Deb O'Neill was genuine. She was really going after this. And it came out not just in this this Professor Guthrie's testimony, it came out in Professor Alan Fell's testimony, where he was stating categorically, we've got to separate the auditors between auditing and consulting. And the Liberals are putting up all kinds of objections, do we have to, etc. And one of the questions was, well, what about unintended consequences? Right? Now, this is an important thing, of course, but it always gets put up. And Alan Fels said, I loved his answer, he goes, not all unintended consequences are negative. Right? In this area, it's such a bad problem, that's the least reason you would stop it. We've got to get rid of this conflict of interest. And so with this, there's a growing drumbeat, if you will. That's what I'm trying to explain. There's signs in the Labor Party, and for once, I think that this will go through till next year. It'll be in Parliament for a while. The fact that it's there, in a sense, means this inquiry cuts to the chase. The inquiry, who knows what the inquiry is going to recommend, but there's already a bill there that'll do the right thing. The Auditor General testified at this hearing, and I got to give him a copy of the bill to make sure he had it, because it'll give him the job, right? And he appreciated getting a copy. And yeah, so everyone knows now there's a bill in Parliament. It's just about mustering the political will to make it happen.
Excellent. Okay, so the fridge is definitely on the move. It's just now a question of how far it can be lifted and how much can be exposed. But at least it's in momentum.
Yes. And it's one of a number of things. We see all these things as connected. We're fighting the cash ban at the moment. Who's pushing the cash ban? One of these big 4 auditors, right? You can't trust their ulterior motives, but you've got to look at the financial system as a whole. We're trying to get this financial system back to being something that's functional, because at the moment it's completely dysfunctional. It only serves vested interests, and these are the various initiatives that can make sure that we can identify what the problems are, because then we can put up real reforms. And of course, we've already got we have a good idea what's in there. I would urge your viewers to go reread your submission to this auditing inquiry, where it's pretty stark about what you say is in the banks, right? There's reforms that we know will go a long way towards dealing with that, such as Glass-Steagall bank separation, such as we would advocate a national bank, right, that can provide a public option that can make the private banks compete fairly, etc., and also be something that can be a backstop to the financial system. These are the things that should go ahead anyway, but we think this auditing inquiry will prove that.
Yeah, and the key point to make, Robbie, is that all of those elements, right, so the bail-in, the auditing, the cash ban, all of those things, it's not separate things, right? This is actually the same Rubik's Cube that you're just looking at different faces of, right? And what we're talking about here is structural reform of the finance system to the benefit of Australia and Australians, and that's ultimately what this is about.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate your time today, and we'll keep our viewers informed as things progress, eh?
Thanks very much, Martin.
Thanks. Talk to you again soon. Cheers. So, another piece of the financial reform jigsaw puzzle. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.